lays out the budget problem as it now appears. You've already received the legislative analyst's estimate of $25.4 billion, but now we're looking at a possible increase in that deficit of about $2.7 billion, which would total a deficit of $28.1 billion for the coming budget year. And this latest increase comes from actions that are taking place in the Congress that change the estate and inheritance tax laws that will have an effect on California of that amount in the coming year, and then of over $1 billion going forward forever. We know this deficit this year is about $6 billion after all the work and the solutions that were entered into in October. But going forward, it appears to be a lot higher. Matt, can you explain that? The next slides.
I think if you looked at our current year situation, you would see, maybe somewhat surprisingly, that our revenues are in line with our spending. And people would rightly ask, well, what happened? How do you fall out of balance so quickly in just a short period of time? Well, I think that's primarily because we've adopted so many temporary or short-term solutions. And you see on the slide that in 10-11 this year, the temporary increases that were enacted 2 years ago expire. They will all lapse by the end of this fiscal year. They won't be available in 11-12. So your revenues are $8.3 billion lower than they were this year. We also took other actions in the form of selling some state assets, special fund loans, that were one-time in nature. They're here this year, they're not here next year. Similarly, on the spending side, the number this year is higher, it's lower than it otherwise would be because we had so much federal dollars that offset general fund spending. Once the federal dollars go away next year, general fund spending has to rise to accommodate those program costs. So that's why the gap that is not here this year grows so rapidly by 11-12.
Mr. Speaker, do you have a question for Mac?
Actually, Mac, if we can go back to that, in 2007, the long-term LAO forecast projected revenues of approximately $125 billion for the 2011-2012 year. 3 years later, revenues are instead expected to be about $83 billion in 2011-12. This is a drop of roughly a third in revenues, and I think it's important to get a sense of where the revenues will be over the next few years and get clarification of the fact that we've already cut over $20 billion from the 2007 projection. Given this fact, I think it's important for you to add some clarification not only to where we expect the revenues to be over the next several years, but whether or not we have a problem of not enough revenues instead of this notion that we just have out-of-control spending.
I think we have some slides that speak to that. Let me first start with this next graph, which shows our projected problem over the 4 years subsequent to the budget year. And this was in our report that we published last month also. And it's to give the legislature just an idea of, does your problem on the natural get worse, or does it get better? Does the economy grow faster that allows you to shrink that operating deficit on the natural? And I think you can see from the numbers that the problem persists. And what that means is, based on our projections, revenue growth is commensurate with projected spending increases. So the problem stays the same. You've got an ongoing, at least for the very near future, you have an ongoing problem of roughly $20 billion. I think on this next picture, again, speaks a little bit, I think, to the speaker's question. This shows you how bad the problem has been. It's a little bit of a busy chart, but I think it's pretty powerful too. What it shows for the last 4 downturns or recessions that the state has experienced, what has been the magnitude of our job loss since the peak just prior to the start of each recession, and how long does it take before you get back to the job level you were at from that peak, the start of the recession. And if you look at the bottom line, that's our current situation, the red line. And you can see 2 pretty dramatic stories, I think. First of all, the amount of the job loss, 9%, is well over twice what we've experienced in any of the prior recessions. And then secondly, you see how long it takes, going across the top of the chart from left to right, in years to get back the job level we were at prior to the start of the problem. We're projecting, and again, it's just a projection in the case of the red line, that it'll take us about 8 years before our job total is the same level as it was before the start of the recession.
So, Matthew, are we at the point where the line is starting to go up?
Yes, we are.
We're at the bottom of the ascendancy.
We're starting to grow a little bit, but very modestly.
It's a long line, and you can see that it's very dramatic. In the 3 previous recessions, although they were different, they never got as bad, and they never took as long. And that puts us in a very unique situation. So that's not the only thing we're facing. Looking out into the future, you've got some other problems that are real. They're not completely nailed down yet, but they're very serious threats that make our problem even worse than the previous slide shows. Anna, do you want to explain that?
Sure, thank you. This slide illustrates a number of the different threats that California faces in the future. Some of these are fairly near term, and we're dealing with them right now. They're impacting our budget for next year. Some of these are very much into the future. They're a decade away, or they're a few years away. The first is pension liabilities. Much has been discussed about our pension liabilities. Based on the estimates prepared by the pension fund and by the teachers' retirement fund, we have a $100 billion liability. Other estimates have it as high as $500 billion. We also have a deficit in an unemployment insurance fund, and that deficit is $10.3 billion at the latest projections. Outstanding budgetary borrowing of $15.3 billion. The cost associated with outstanding budgetary borrowing and these types of solutions into next year's budget deficit is about $2.8 billion. In healthcare reform, the costs start in a few years. They grow by 2021, and the most recent estimate of the cost of healthcare reform will result in California will be $3.5 billion.
And if I could just interject, if you notice the outstanding borrowing, that's a series of things, the economic recovery bonds, borrowing from local government, things like that. But the cost of it ongoing is almost $3 billion. So that gives a cautionary signal to those who say, well, let's borrow some more. Borrowing's not a free good. It entails more deficit just to sustain the borrowing. I think that's pretty important to realize. You've got another slide there.
So this next slide, and I'll try to walk you through it, it attempts to explain a little bit about what has happened in our budget in the last 10 years. And it ends with the beginning of this most recent downturn. As you can see in the early part of the last decade, California had a really substantial increase in its revenues from 98-99 to 99-2000. This was associated with the dot-com growth and then the dot-com bust. As you can see, our spending then rose to meet those higher revenues and increased beyond that level. California was relatively slow to adjust to the falling revenues after the dot-com boost, and that gap between the red line and the green line in those first few years accounts for about $15 billion of deficit. Subsequently, we had a period of a fairly flat level of spending. There was another period. There was the reduction in the vehicle license fee, the issuance of the economic recovery bonds, and as you can see, we had a bit of an economic rebound, and we had a fairly steep growth in our revenues between 4.5 and 6.7. When we get into 2006-7 and 2007-8, it starts to slow down, and at that point in time, we came into this most recent economic downturn with about a $7 billion structural budget deficit that Matt can talk to you some more about.